I hope that you now feel fully engaged and ready to think about where we were with the Bretton Woods institutions, following on with some of the history that we heard last night from Ben Steele and Gillian Tett, but also thinking, I certainly spend quite a lot of my time thinking about how well suited are any of these institutions to the challenges we face, and how different, being here makes you think about some of the big differences in the sort of nature of the challenges we face now, and what are the big challenges for international cooperation, and how have they changed in these 75 years. We had Larry Summers, who Meg and I, full disclosure, have both worked for at different times in our career, but listening to him last night as well, I think put a different kind of perspective on it. But initially, I think we probably want to just talk a little bit about the book that you were all given, and I'm sure your hearts leapt when you saw a 430-page volume with lots of contributions from important people. I know I did as I got on the plane and thought, oh dear, I've got to read this now. But I can tell you, having read quite a lot of it, there's some good stuff in here. And I think, Meg, a good way to, maybe we should just kick off with you telling us, having been very closely involved in this volume, and you were telling me, having to cajole some of these very important people to write more interestingly, what is there here? I certainly found quite a lot that was very interesting, but what do you think the people in this room should get from this volume, especially in the context of this conference?
Okay, now it's on. Thank you. Thank you, Stephanie. One thing, coming back to Bretton Woods in 1944, I wouldn't have been in the room, and you wouldn't have been in the room.
Quite true.
It was all men, and some things have changed a lot. We've had women prime ministers, presidents, but at the IMF, I was the only woman executive director my whole time there, which was pretty amazing. I mean, that countries didn't opt into. It's changed. There are more. And of course, Christine Lagarde,
we've had the head of the IMF,
a really, really effective woman, and she'll be great at the European Central Bank. But let me, since I know there's a busy agenda today, just turn a bit to telling you about what's in this volume. And I realize for many of you, well, no one's going to pick it up and read it cover to cover, but there are a lot of different issues covered in there. And whatever your area is, you may find something or something from a contributor that really piques your interest, is in your area, and you'll be able to find that in this volume. But basically, what the authors are doing is looking at how can the global economic system generate prosperity, and not just prosperity for the 1% or the 10%, but more broadly through our economies. And so they're looking back, there's a lot of looking back over what these basic three Bretton Woods institutions, even though the WTO didn't actually come into being until quite a bit later, started out as the GATT, but how can they adapt today? You heard Summers last night talk about, after World War II, it was very different. I mean, basically rebuilding a system that would lead to some level of cooperation and avoid the kind of economic disruption that could ultimately lead to war. So sort of different goal, what we're trying to do today. But what's interesting, very short first essay by Paul Volcker, former chairman of the Federal Reserve. If you look at what he is pleading with global leaders, citizens, leaders across the spectrum, to revitalize the spirit of Bretton Woods. And by spirit of Bretton Woods, it's not necessarily there's going to be another big meeting, another big outcome, setting up new global institutions, but the spirit of recognizing how interconnected we are, how what we do affects everyone else, and how we're affected by the rest of the world, and try and cooperate a little bit better, that spirit of Bretton Woods. Now, we heard a little bit from Ben last night that the spirit at Bretton Woods itself may not have been all that collaborative, but in the end, they agreed. And in agreeing, they did what? They committed their governments to go back and get public approval. It was treaties. These are international treaties at the IMF, World Bank, WTO, meaning you are committed. That treaty becomes part of your national law. You're committed to do certain things. And that's a big commitment on the part of, and they did that in 1944. much harder to do these days, as you know. Stephanie's came over from London, where they're about to leave the EU. The UK is about to leave the EU. All sorts of challenges around the world in terms of rising nationalism. But can we try and find a way to get back to that spirit? And so the Bretton Woods Committee, and Emily Slater is here with me, the vice president there, deputy director, just basically put together this volume to try and get the impressions from around the world of what needs to be done. What are the problems? What needs to be done? So I think you'll find, if you want to look at some of the things, for an institutional view, and the three leaders of the organizations have all presented short essays, and they talk about sort of, a lot of it is, I think, they're personal. It's not just an official institutional view, but it's, Christine Lagarde is pleading for cooperation, innovation, working together, figuring out how we can deal with the problems of today. And she knows firsthand from how frustrating it can be trying to get decisions through the executive board at the IMF, 24 members, working within the G20 or the other organizations to try and get a common view that can then help guide what the institutions do. So not an easy task. David Malpass, who's at the new president of the World Bank, I think a lot of people were a little worried that he'd come in and want to shut down the World Bank. Well, David Malpass has taken very much an approach that the World Bank is here to help countries make their economies, make their people better off. So he's always looking at how can you bring up median income? How can everybody be a bit better off? How do we get business communities to be a little bit more proactive in developing the skills, the needs of their labor forces? How do we get people to accommodate to that change? And then, of course, you have the head of the WTO, Roberto Azevedo, with a really big challenge on his hands. We can talk a little bit more about the World Bank, the WTO later. But one thing that he makes clear is his institution is political. I mean, the WTO decides things on consensus, the IMF and World Bank on weighted voting. So Azevedo's making the point how political his institution is. Well, the reality is all the institutions are political. So, political has many different meanings, but to me, political meant you had, for the institutions to be successful, you had to have ownership on the part of the countries. They had to feel they were part of the decision-making, part of the implementation, so that they would feel what the institution was doing was helpful to their country. Now, just to mention some of the key themes by some of the authors, you have Minister Tarman from Singapore talk about one of the most globally interconnected countries in the world, and he points to there's this fundamental contradiction. And you got a little bit of this from Larry last night about how decision-making occurs at a national level, right? We're in Washington making decisions, Congress and the White House, budget decision, announced yesterday. You're at the Federal Reserve. Under US law, you have to look at these things on the US economy. It's not like we're gonna set Federal Reserve policy, monetary policy, for what's good for the world. That's not the law in the United States. And the European Central Bank has its treaty agreement among those members. They have to adhere to it. So there's this contradiction of how these decisions are made, yet the impact that those decisions have on the rest of the world. And of course, there's awareness of how what goes on in the world affects policies, but it is a fundamental contradiction in the actual decision-making process. A lot of the authors talk about productivity. You all here in this room feel very productive. You know how to get things done quickly, effectively, get the word out. But across our economies, that's a problem in terms of how do you make workers more productive. When they're more productive, their income goes up, they're more effective, they're more adaptable. So how do you make that happen? And that's a big, I'd say, problem in economics today. Why has productivity lagged so much? And so there's, of course, the focus on education, training, making workforces more adaptable. But if you want to have one strong defense of globalization, read Catherine Mann. She's very much global value chains, all this trade, all this investment has led to rising productivity. And it's the rising productivity that has raised your income, your parents' income, your community's income. So don't sell that short. Find a way to make it work. Now, what I thought was interesting was, the emerging markets and developing countries. How frustrated are they with the system? Are they going to walk away from it? Is China going to lead a new system? And it was interesting. Leading Brazilian economist Arminio Fraga was like, no, they're going to work within the system. First of all, leaving the system, very bad example. He pointed to Venezuela and North Korea. It doesn't even have to be that extreme set of examples. But basically, and of course, in my experience at the IMF, I saw these countries, even low-income countries in Africa, they wanted to be part of the system, they wanted to benefit, and they wanted to have a voice in the system. That's one thing that's very important, and this was a criticism of many of the authors. The voice and vote in the IMF and World Bank. These voting majorities were set up years ago, and a vote, you have 100%, you have shares, right, voting shares. If reallocate that more to one set of countries, because they've been growing a lot, that means another set of countries has to give some up. That's very hard for countries' governments to do, is give up. So there's a lot of frustration that hasn't adapted in those institutions. And I tried mightily when I was there to get some of that done and to get the US Congress to approve some of these changes. And it's always a challenge, even though the US voting share wasn't really changing, because the US was pretty much staying where it was. But it's those pesky Europeans that didn't quite want to give up what they've had all these years. So that's very tough, not to criticize my European friends. On the development side, I would urge you to look at Minister Indrawati from Indonesia. She was also at the World Bank as a senior manager there. And she really wants the institutions to help countries help themselves. I mean, that's a theme of many. How do you make these institutions better? Knowledge institutions. How can they help us learn from each other? Can these institutions keep up with the changes in the world, the technological changes, digital economy that many of you are talking about? Can the institutions help countries that are a little further back on that spectrum sort of leapfrog all the problems maybe the rest of us have gone through and be ready to adapt? And that may be a little bit of a worry if there's enough of that talent there, that willingness or ability to keep up. But it's really need to keep strengthen the resilience of our economies, of our workforces, get them ready, able to meet the technological changes that are coming. Now, one theme that resonates in many of them is trust. And I'm sure you just went through an exercise that was a little bit about trust, right? Telling each other deeply personal things. Did you trust your partner? You didn't even know that person, right? It's about trust. So for all of you, do you trust your own government? Do you trust it to fight corruption, to be transparent, to make sure that everything's above board and your taxes you pay are being used effectively? So that's a big element of trust. Corruption, worries about corruption. But there's a lot more about that. Trust is also the quality of advice. What's the advice countries get from the institution? Do they trust that it's the best advice, that it'll help them? I mean, we went through a big rethink in Europe where the IMF maybe originally pushed too much of a fiscal adjustment. The economy's contracted dramatically, and it made things much worse. Need a little bit more trust in trying to figure out getting the right advice. Of course, the IMF owned up to that and did a little bit better, but of course, the problem is always, where's the money going to come from? But how do you manage the risks of modern technology? And that's one of the challenges the institutions are going to face. The private sectors also felt a little bit of frustration in terms of, do the institutions listen to the problems we raise about what they're proposing, what the policies they're discussing? Private sector individuals, they feel they can come in and point to, boy, if you push this policy on this country, or if this country wants to do that policy, it's going to have negative repercussions. Let me tell you what they are. And it may be that investors will pull out of the country, or there won't be the capital inflows that the IMF, the country, are putting into their tables because investors won't see it as a friendly climate. So these are the things that, if you want to succeed, you do need private sector engagement, not just internationally, but you need the domestic private sector, again, that trust, to feel that they can undertake investment in their own economy, create jobs, and help bring that economy out of its downturn. Now, this brings me to a point that I thought was really interesting. There was no general pitch on the part of these authors for more development money. You know, talk about multilateral development goals, need more development aid. That was not the theme of any of these. The theme is, how do you mobilize resources? The needs of countries are so huge, they far exceed what any multilateral or bilateral, USAID or the European aid agencies or Japan, can provide. So how do you mobilize the private sector to get in there? And so there are new areas of development finance that are discussed in the book, but it's how do you do things that'll bring in pension fund money, very long-term money, insurance fund investment, long-term money, and these are the kinds of things maybe the institutions can be a bit helpful of. There's also a big push on part of one of the Chinese authors, K.U. Jin, in terms of networking. Networking is the future. It's going to cross borders. It's going to involve, you know, go beyond countries. Are we ready for it? We should adapt and look at the positives. Of course, there's a big debate now about whether or not we're all comfortable with that. And of course, several authors pointed to the conundrum, Larry mentioned it a bit last night, of here's the US dollar, a national currency, yet it's become the currency used in the international system. How is that going to work? Should there be an alternative? And the bottom line is there's really no good alternative out there right now. And certainly no willingness to have any kind of a global institution. Anytime this would come up at the IMF, I would always point to, well, let's see how that Eurozone thing works out, right? Where these countries have committed to be in a monetary bloc, sort of like-minded and, you know, really wanting to do this. The challenges they face, I think, give the rest of us pause in terms of any ideas of a global currency. What's the challenge for all of you here in this room? Because you are internationally engaged. You came to this conference. You're not just in a little cubby hole in your own country not paying attention. You're here. How do we convince our publics, our medias at home, our legislatures, our citizens, our own people that international engagement has benefits? How do we do that? How do we convince them? Former congressman who's a member of the Bretton Woods Committee board, Jim Colby, says we need much better messaging. But let me just give you an example of how tough it is to have good messaging, and I'll try and wrap up, Stephanie, so we can turn to our discussion. When I was at a WTO conference in Seattle years ago, 99, whenever it was, Battle of Seattle, there were huge demonstrations, shut down the city, we were locked in our hotel at times, but anyway, so one day, you know, there's the labor march. All the unions are out there marching against trade, against the World Trade Organization, WTO, and it is in Seattle. In that march were Boeing workers. Boeing workers make aircraft. That company is a huge global company. If they do not export, if those airplanes aren't sold worldwide, Boeing is going to be much smaller. It's going to have many fewer workers. It's not going to be as productive. Trade has made Boeing great. Other problems have set them back a little bit lately, but so I was handling trade and investment issues at Treasury at the time, US Treasury. I was really taken aback. You know, their livelihood depends on trade, and here they're out protesting trade. So how do you get even those that have benefited from trade to speak up and acknowledge that and advocate for it? It was really, really frustrating. But what this points to, too, and we can talk about this a little bit, is when you do open to trade, and this was a theme of the last US presidential election, what happens at times? Okay, a company moves overseas, shuts down its plant, and if that's really the only big employer in a town in Ohio or West Virginia, it has a huge impact. And that town shrinks and poverty grows. What do you do about that? How do you get another employer to come in, retrain workers? How do you handle that? How do you have the kind of pension benefits that people can keep, even if their company disappears? How do you handle health benefits so that people can keep it, even if they change jobs a lot? These are the kind of issues that are going to help make our workforces more resilient and able to handle the challenges of globalization. So it just goes to show it's all interconnected. One last thing, those of you in the business community here, global leaders in your area, your company, I urge you to read Gail Kelly's essay, because she says, you in the business community, you need to set a new tone. You need to be leaders. You're not just out there making money. You're part of your community, you're employing people, but you're also interacting with their families, with the communities. Accept that, be responsible for that, and be an advocate for the benefits of that interaction that is helping your company. So she challenges the business community to be a little bit more forceful advocate for that international engagement. So, what problems do we face now? You all know very well. We've got climate change. I just came from Washington, where it was roasting last weekend. Impossible to be outside, really horrible. You've got climate change. You've got mass migration that we've seen, and there's probably more to come as a result of climate change. You have rapid technological change. How do we keep up with everything going on? You know, you guys doing digital currency. There's a lot of nervousness about that. You heard that last night. You've heard it from the US Congress. All these things. How can we handle, how can we adapt to it? How can we prepare? And how can we help people that feel totally unprepared to handle all that still deal with it and become more resilient? That's the challenge for these institutions. For us, all of us collectively, use our international institutions. We have that framework in place. Can we use that framework to try and come up with some solutions, listen to each other, try and figure out what works, and be a force for good for the next 75 years? That's the challenge. I urge all of you to take it on. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've got a lot to get into there, and I think there's lots of things that we could talk about, and we'll get on to questions pretty soon, I think, because I know lots of people will be interested. I mean, if we look back, I guess for me, there's sort of how the world has changed in the last 75 years, in part because of the efforts of people in Bretton Woods and what followed. But there's also potentially the kind of gaps in the framework that were perhaps ignored over the years, which have come back to bite us and have produced some of the challenges that you talked about. But I mean, and people keep on saying this, and I heard it a lot last night, but I guess we shouldn't forget how much the world has changed in a good way since 1944. And that was one of the things that comes up in this book. But it's striking to me, when they sat down here, 75% of the world's population lived in absolute poverty. Now it's 10%. That's an extraordinary thing. And a lot of that improvement has been just since 1990. So even the very young people in the audience, it's more or less in people's lifetimes here, that complete transformation. As more people have gone to university in the world in the last 30 years than added up in the previous 3,000 years in the world. We've seen world hunger just since 1990 fall by 40%. Child poverty, extreme poverty, child mortality, halved, and extreme poverty fall by 75% since 1990. So just in the period where we feel like there's been a lot of the challenges of globalization, we should just keep, and I know people keep saying this, but we just keep remembering that there has been what any kind of Martian would consider to be an enormous improvement in the world. With that, and you touched on it, there's this enormous change in the global balance of economic power, not political power yet, but economic power. You know, in 1980, the US and Europe alone were half of global GDP. That's now 30%. And it's probably going to be about 25% by 2050. In 1980, China and India combined was 5% of the global economy. Now it's nearly 30, 28%. So that I'm interested in, how does that, we've had these changes around the edges of the voting shares of things like the IMF and the World Bank, but symbolically you still have that dominant power of these institutions being controlled still by the same powers who were sitting here, the winners of the World War II. But when you look back, you would still say, and Larry touched on this last night, there is a challenge we face, which the political challenge of global cooperation is diametrically different from what they faced when they were sitting here. Sitting here, they were galvanized by that absolute fear of economic nationalism and where it could lead, and never having a war again, things that Larry talked about last night. Now we have widespread suspicion of multilateralism, suspicion of cooperation. And I think you've said it very well. It's about the challenge is not how can we have any kind of a cooperation. It's how can we make the cooperation that we have fit within a world of nations, and have nations feel comfortable with themselves and with globalization, not feel like they have to choose this choice of being outward-looking or inward-looking, and so many countries becoming more inward-looking. And I was trying, as I read the book, I was trying to think, well, where were the things that were missed out in this system, and what are the gaps that we now have to fill? I think there's a couple that really struck me. One is that we focused, and certainly in the period that I've been involved in economics, when we thought about globalization, when I was just at Harvard in the early mid-90s, we were focused on how would the increasing flow of goods and capital work for people and countries? How are we going to deal with the consequences of that? And I think there were two kind of mistaken assumptions there. One was that the flow of labor was not going to also be an enormous issue. I feel like that was something that was just, a lot of the conversations that I had, certainly in the UK, obviously immigration was a big part of leading up to the concerns around, or galvanizing force for the Brexit result, because people felt that their communities had not been able to absorb the number of people who came from other parts of Europe. But you've seen more dramatically, you've seen the flows of migrants into Europe and the political consequences of immigration into the US. Just not something that the sort of right-thinking internationalist crowd really engaged with when you and I were at US Treasury. So that's one thing. We were kind of focused on goods and capital and maybe didn't think about what labor flows were going to mean. And the other thing was, I think, this sort of assumption, which is sometimes right and sometimes wrong, that what was good for companies and what was making life easier for companies in terms of their trading environment and protecting their international intellectual property was also going to be good for people at home and people in the countries that they were sort of technically from. And as you've mentioned, in fact, for all its successes, that sort of those very sophisticated supply chains could produce some great productivity growth, but also had real impacts in local communities that were not addressed and have left also these kind of festering political things. So if you think about that political challenge, making people comfortable with globalization again, or making a world, whatever the phrase is, making a world that works for everybody, are these institutions the ones who can help us do that? Or are they just too tainted with their association with the kind of globalization we've had till now?
Well, that's a very good question, because I wouldn't say that they're tainted necessarily, but remember, the membership of the institutions is governments, right? Governments representing their countries. And the governments get very sensitive about, you're telling me what's good for my citizens? Excuse me, I'm the elected official in my country. I know what's good for or even if they're not elected, I know what's good for my citizens. Why do you think you, coming from Washington, can tell me what my citizens need? So that's always been the tension at the IMF. Like originally, when they were designing adjustment programs originally, it was just like, here's your fiscal target, for your government deficit. You go meet it whatever way you want. Raise taxes, cut spending. We'll let you do that. Well, what's happened over the years? What did they cut? Countries cut social spending, right? And kept the presidential plane on the budget. So the IMF and the World Bank, too, kind of woke up to, that really doesn't work. You don't fix the problems in your country that way, and you certainly don't build popular support for the program. So there's been a much bigger push for protecting social spending. in programs. And so the IMF will make sure, and this has been part of programs, whether it's been in Ukraine or Egypt or Pakistan, focus on protecting the poorest as well. Now, in protecting the poorest, sometimes that doesn't really benefit the middle class all that much. And that's part of the problem, and that's where you can get pushback in countries. Civil servants that have really nice jobs, even if they're not very productive, don't want to give them up. So they'll be good at pushing back to keep their benefits and may not be as concerned. So it's a difficult domestic dynamic in every single country of the world. And people here come from all over the world. You all are very familiar with how within your own country, how difficult it is to satisfy the wide variety of demands that citizens have. So the institutions try, but the institutions do not have the capability to run around and do surveys. Did that social spending go to the people who really needed it? They just do not have the capacity. The people, I mean, they're relatively, certainly the IMF is pretty small, or under 3,000 people, to verify it. And so that comes back to the country itself. Yeah, we're spending more in social welfare. We're protecting the poorest. We have our unemployment benefits to make sure that the people that it's aimed at benefit from it. So it is a challenge for the institutions, but it's hard for the institutions to do it themselves, working with the countries to make sure that there's and then the adjustment program, whatever it is, will have a bigger chance of success if there's more buy-in. We use the word ownership a lot. If its own people feel ownership in their own program, it'll be implemented better and might actually achieve the desired results.
And you mentioned also that the technological challenges which loom much larger now than they did in 1944. We have Bloomberg Economics, we've got economists and reporters, and the economists, we did a study last year that was just looking at what the future global labor force growth was going to be. And it's interesting that all of the growth in the global labor force of the last 20, 30 years, and the story that we all know is the growth in the unskilled labor. And that was China entering the global labor force and how that's kind of transformed the global labor market. Pretty much all the growth in the global labor force in the next 20 years is going to be in skilled workers. So in a sense, that old story of globalization is now done, of unskilled workers entering the global workforce and perhaps leveling the playing field for some others. And we now have skilled workers, 80% of them from emerging market economies, are going to be the global labor force growth of the future. How is that going to change the game at a time when we know skilled workers more often work in service sector of the economy? That hasn't normally been tradable. Now increasingly it's tradable because of technology, because of digital trade. It doesn't feel like, we had something on our podcast the other day, someone talking about his son playing Fortnite, liked to play Fortnite in Brazil. He's sitting in Washington, D.C. But he plays against Brazilian players on a Brazilian server because they're not quite as good as the Americans, so he tends to do better on Fortnite. That struck me as a great example, actually unusual example of the American skilled student, 15-year-old, competing successfully against the emerging market competition in Brazil. But this is a digital trade that is not captured in any statistics. It's not something that's captured by the WTO. I mean, are these how are those? Is that challenge going to be handled? Does it need to be handled? If you have a whole new chunk, if trade is going to be increasingly digital, and we're going to face also, of course, all these challenges around internet companies that are more dominant than any companies in the history of the world have ever been.
Well, it'll be driven by fear of government officials that they don't know what's going on and that they're afraid of what might be happening. It's when there's some big disruption as a result of some of this, whether a data breach or privacy concerns, it'll come back to bite everyone. But with that said, there's really no good sense of, well, how do you manage it? How do you regulate it? I mean, talk about Facebook doing a digital coin. I mean, that's just why are you doing that? I don't really quite
I'm sure there's lots of people in the room who could answer that
I'm
particular
sure,
question.
and it's just, okay, but it just makes people really, really nervous, right? And you heard that in Washington. You heard Larry last night, maybe not so much nervous as downplaying the impact, but given what goes on in the world, and you look at the big, we all look at what's going on in China in terms of monitoring citizens. This bit about, are you socially adept, or are you a problem? And you get rated, and facial recognition everywhere. Well, that makes a lot of people very nervous. Now, with that said, there are cameras everywhere all over the world watching what we're all doing all the time. That we should recognize that and be careful. But it's just, how far are we willing to go on all this networking, all this relationship, and how do we need to regulate it the way we regulate banks, right? What's at risk? We don't even quite know what all the risks might be. So what'll happen is there'll be some big disruption, some big problem. People will go, well, we need to do something about it. But it's very hard to anticipate that. And that's a problem with a lot of technological change. We don't really know what's coming at us. Some of you here in this room may know because you're working on it and you know it's going to be a big success. But for all us ordinary people, I'm talking about in the technological realm, people get nervous. Think of your parents' generation, which is my generation, right? And it's just, people get nervous and they get worried. So how do you manage things so that the benefits are there? And this is way beyond the capability of the institutions. Let me just put it that way, way beyond.
We should, we're getting into lots of things, but I want to get reactions from people in the audience. But there's one last sort of chunk of things I wanted to ask about, which is this question of leadership. And it goes a little bit through here. You have a lot of sort of implicit or explicit references to the abdication of US leadership. And in some cases, actually, the US actively now campaigning against institutions that it established. And I just wondered what you think about what the new locus of collaboration could be inside or outside of these institutions if you no longer have an active US. I mean, I had conversations with people in, senior officials in the G7 economies who talk about sort of side meetings that they now have at the G20 or the G7 where they're sort of trying to keep there is actually a club for multilaterals at the G20 meetings. They had a little dinner. G7, they go off and they drink late into the night. I'm not making this up. But they're trying to sort of think of ways to keep activity alive.
And is the US there?
And the US is not there because they're cooperative. So this is Canada, the European countries, Japan. They're trying to think of ways to sort of keep the multilateralist flame alive while there's a certain sort of absenteeism or indeed opposition from the US. So that's one approach to how you replace US leadership. And we saw that they fought for very hard in '44. Another thing that one might fear is that China is readying itself, as Gillian suggested yesterday, simply to replace. And there's some discussion of that in this book. Is there now a rival model, economic model that could also be then take a leadership role in these institutions? What would that mean? The fact that you've got effectively a non-democracy, but a very successful economy, taking a leading role in these institutions. Partly because we're here, I wondered, is there a third model, which is that cities and nations, non-government actors, or maybe sub-government actors, could be taking that role? And we know, certainly with Bloomberg, we know there's been a lot of cities getting together globally to try and do things, for example, on environmental, on decarbonisation, that their own governments are not willing to do. So do you think all three of those are sort of live options? What do you think?
Yeah, there are a lot of live options out there. Starting with the last, I know there's a lot going on the city side. There's some folks at the Wilson Center, where I am in Washington, doing exactly that because these are the people that are on the ground, you know, the mayors, the city council members. They're dealing with problems. They're dealing with flooding coming in terms of, you know, a high tide every other weekend, whatever it may be, aging infrastructure. They've got all the same problems across many cities globally, and they do learn from each other in terms of, you know, seek out solutions, try and collaborate, get ideas, and that happens no matter, you know, that's going to continue.
In the US, they're going ahead with the climate change accord.
No, I know. That's it. You see much more, you know, because they see all the immediate, every day on their own citizens where they're living too, right? These officials are living in that community. So yes, I do think that'll continue, and that may be some of the most effective. But in terms of an overarching look at, you know, looking at our overall global system in terms of, you know, money flows, how we deal with, you know, currency problems, that sort of thing, we're still going to need a core group, and it's going to have China in it because China's just too big, too important. And just from my experience at the IMF, anytime we're trying to come up with a policy change, it needed to be a collaborative, bring most of the members around the board, bring them along, because, you know, 51% vote at the IMF on the board, you know, slim majority, just getting it through, it's not going to work. It won't be effectively implemented. You need to have a much broader support to have countries buy into that policy change and be willing to be part of it through the IMF. So I always felt, you know, and I spent a lot of time talking with my Chinese counterpart or my Brazilian counterpart, or I sat next to the Indian representatives for several years. We were always, you know, and we're next door neighbors in our offices, just in terms of, yes, what do you think your country is willing to do? How are we part of the solution? And it was always because I knew the US cannot do it alone. And this is what's so frustrating now. The US can't do it alone. We really do need to collaborate with other countries to achieve objectives. And so starting a group, though, without the US isn't going to help. That isn't going to be effective either. And there are many times at the IMF where, I mean, other countries didn't want to go ahead with something without knowing where I was. And I found that a little bit frustrating at times. You know, it's like, oh, here's an idea. And I'd say, oh, that's a good idea. And they'd be, well, Meg, you go first, and I'll chime in and support it. And I was like, no, no, no. I've got some other priorities that I'm really working hard on. You go first, and I'll support you. You know, they're reluctant to stick their neck out.
Because they were worried that you as the US would then say, oh, actually, I don't like that. And then they're stuck on the wrong
but
side.
The thing is they didn't want to do it. Even if I said, oh, that was a good idea, we can support that, they still wanted me to be the one pushing it. And at times I thought, wouldn't it be more effective if it came from you? Because people get, you know, might be a little annoyed at US for one reason or another. And it just really struck me how important it was on everything. Where's the US? Where's the US? It's not just this, you know, countries, are you going to vote against it? Or it's really on the policies too, or the ideas, right? We're always trying to bring each other along on good ideas, especially a lot of the low-income country work took a really wide collaboration with some very rewarding results, I have to say. We'll talk about that another time. But, I mean, I'm glad there's still a lot of discussion going on among countries. And I urge all my counterparts, former counterparts that I see around the world, that keep up your contacts with US officials so that when the next big crisis happens, which it probably will, you have those contacts, you can talk to each other, you can work out a solution. There are still a lot of US officials doing that, so, you know, it's not all negative. You know, what you see are the headlines. So we've got to keep those channels and the channels of communication are open. I know there's a lot of frustration out there on the part with the US, but I don't think there's quite a walking away from US involvement in things. So we've got to find a way, keep things going enough at least at, you know, maybe a sort of lower level so there's enough engagement.
And I guess there's also, there's a change of feeling around. When I was at US Treasury working with Summers and you were at the IMF, there was actually a lively, in that period, the sort of late 90s, there was lively competition before as then was mainly G7, G8 meetings or IMF, World Bank meetings, to have an idea, have a proposal.
Exactly.
And particularly Gordon Brown in the UK and Mary would have something of a competition for who would have the deliverable that other people would sign up to. And there's just a lack of engagement now, even at that senior level, that you sense that people don't really see any great political capital to be gained from coming back from a summit and saying, my initiative won out. But maybe you need more a pressing sense of crises for that. So questions or short comments?
And could you identify yourself too,
Oh,
please?
certainly. Frances Stacy from Optimal Capital, multifamily office. Really quickly, what do you think that the role of debt, both public and private, is going to play in the future? I'm quintessentially your sort of socially liberal person, but fiscal conservative. And I know that there's probably everyone here who has a social program in mind that they're advocating for. And how we pay for those social programs in the face of debt. What is your view about negative interest rates? And do you think that negative interest rates are coming to the US?
Debt. It's funny how we all have good ideas of things that need to be done, but we don't want to pay for them. And so we end up borrowing money. And in doing that, what I find interesting is, countries in crisis, the deficit debt becomes a financial constraint. They can't borrow any more money, internationally to pay, they need foreign currency to pay their debts. With the US, that's not really the situation, or Japan, or you look at the Eurozone as an entity, because it's all sort of, not that the debt isn't held externally, but with a global currency, you can get away with issuing a lot of debt, people buy it, and it doesn't get to be a problem. The interesting thing in the US is it becomes more of a political constraint before it becomes a real economic constraint, and you'll see it, now there's a budget deal announced yesterday, higher spending, and excuse me, but there are not higher taxes in that. So yes, probably a bigger deficit and more debt in the US. Then we have a presidential election next year, and someone, depending, it'll probably come up a lot in primaries, and then we'll see who ends up, right, in terms of, but the debt, and the thing is, when you look around the world, there's a lot more corporate debt, private sector debt in a lot of countries, developing countries too. And there's growing debt again on the part of governments. And you see this in some of the low-income countries that now are able to borrow externally or borrowing more from China of one form or another for Belt and Road projects. And that may come back to be a constraint too. And I can tell you there really won't be a whole lot of appetite for doing another big round of debt forgiveness. And on the part of the US government and European governments, Japan, aid to low-income countries is concessional now. It's grants. So there's very little debt owed to US, Europe, Japan, and on the part of a lot of these very low-income countries, they owe the debt to China. So it'll be real interesting to see how that gets worked out. China's been willing to roll over a lot, but sometimes it's on not very friendly terms, like with Sri Lanka and the port. So we'll see what kind of backlash there is. Others have already pushed back. Malaysia, other countries have pushed back on China. No, that project really isn't going to bring quite the benefits that that'll enable us to pay you back. So there's been a scaling back of some of the projects. I do worry a little bit about Pakistan, which is getting a lot of Chinese money, a lot of investment, and I'm not sure the kind of policy reforms are going to generate enough dynamism in that economy to enable them to pay this back easily. Negative interest rates, I think, would be really a hard thing for the US to accept. I mean, it's amazing in the European Central having bigger, lower, more negative rates. I mean, that's going to stimulate private borrowing. Maybe, Stephanie, you're a little closer on that.
Well, actually, and I would disagree a little bit with you on that. I mean, I think and the two relate. I mean, if we're facing a world of negative interest rates, that's a world of structurally incredibly low interest rates, which then should change your idea about what's a viable fiscal situation and what's a viable amount of debt. So we know, I think we are seeing a change view of what constitutes a sustainable amount of debt, of necessity less than by design. But there are many who would argue, given the structural reasons, including low productivity growth that Megan mentioned, why we now have very low interest rates, actually having looser fiscal policy, running up more debt is, if anything, helping to offset some of that and have interest rates not necessarily go into negative territory. I think it's always been accepted that in the US it would be much harder to have negative rates because the financial system is so much more diverse and you have a lot of ways to get money outside of the banking system. So if you had negative, if it was costing you money to have cash in the banking system, there are lots of other ways that you can avoid that. In Europe, one of the weaknesses of Europe, which we saw in spades after the crisis, is the utter dependence on bank finance. So in that sense, negative rates can be more effective in the US. In Europe, they're incredibly unpopular among banks, surprise, surprise, and particularly the sort of financial institutions in Germany and elsewhere who are now facing these incredibly low interest rates right through to 10-year, 15-year debt. But I think the two sides of your question are kind of, I think if you're worried about negative interest rates, then you don't have to be quite so worried about debt, vice versa. But maybe you have to be worried about one of them, and I guess you could just toss a coin. And
but do you think negative interest rates support social funding?
Well, I think they show a situation where you don't need much of a return on social funding to think that that's probably a good use of money in a world where it's ineffectively free because of the structural things holding down interest rates. I don't think we're going to be in that situation forever, but if we're in that situation for another 10 or 20 years, it could change the way we think about spending. And in the next, with central banks with much less room for maneuver, the next response to the crisis is going to have to involve quite a lot of fiscal, I think, even if we would now say there's not a lot of room for it. That's the tricky situation we're in now. Yeah.
Hi. Belinda Archibong. I'm an assistant professor of economics at Barnard College, Columbia University in New York. So a couple of questions. One on, so completely unrelated questions, but one about this idea about suspicion of cooperation. So one of the things that I've been asked about, because I do most of my work in African countries, is about the ECO, the new currency that the ECOWAS countries are proposing that should go in effect hopefully by next year. And this is, I think it's a very interesting idea. It's potentially great. But there's been a lot of pushback from certain members of the international community that has surprised me. And I'm not sure, as an economist, I understand the kind of theoretical fears with any type of monetary union. But in this particular case, it seems to be something about having a monetary union in emerging markets in African countries that is causing concern. So basically, what are your thoughts on the potential for success or if there are challenges faced by having these types of monetary unions in emerging markets? And I don't know if this is something for people at the IMF, if this has come up, or World Bank. People have been talking about this, but this is something that I've been thinking about recently. Second question is about the labor market. So, it was at the World Bank last year, the whole thing about the future of work. A lot of the discussions have been about trying to transition from informal sector jobs to formal sector jobs, and then trying to understand how first we formalize laborers in emerging markets especially, and then we provide social services. And I'm not actually sure, right? So we talk about the history of work is a history of informality. So I'm not sure that it is actually possible to transition. I'm thinking again in the context of African countries, a large section of laborers from the informal sector to the formal sector. And I think the more important question then is, how do we provide social services? You mentioned social spending, social welfare for people in the informal sector currently, especially in these emerging markets. So again, these are the discussion about switching from informality to formality. Is that where we should be going, or should we be trying to think about how we come up with, social welfare, social spending, targeted, maybe taking advantage of tech, targeted at laborers in the informal sector? So just wanted to know what your thoughts are on that as well.
Yeah, that's two very different issues. But on the currency union, I would just urge any group of countries thinking about that, study the Eurozone closely, but also...
Go on holiday to Greece as a start.
Yeah. But also look at something like the East Caribbean Currency Union, ECCU. They have the East Caribbean Central Bank, and it's a bunch of the smaller Caribbean islands, the more wealthy small Caribbean islands that don't get aid. We're not talking about Haiti here. We're talking about the little bit better off countries, still with a lot of poor people, and it's a terribly difficult process to manage. And all these countries have run up their debt. They keep the currency pegged to the dollar, and it's been very hard to generate job growth and dynamism in these little economies that are still very dependent on tourism. So I would urge a lot of caution on the monetary union side, and it comes back to what I was talking about, trust. Do these countries trust each other to actually give up some of their own sovereignty, like the Eurozone countries did, and submit to a monetary union? And that, I think, is a real tough question. So I'd urge a lot of caution on that. On labor markets, informal to formal, the benefit of bringing people into the formal economy is they become part of the resource base of the economy. It's nice to provide social services to those, but there are a lot of people in the informal economy that might be pretty well off. So you want them participating in paying some taxes too. So the whole point of a lot of these essays is, how do you improve domestic resource mobilization? Within their own country, you need to generate a lot of resources to meet demands, not just for social spending, but for infrastructure, other challenges. So by having more in the formal sector, you broaden your tax base. You can maybe lower tax rates that have been disincentivizing some to pay their taxes, and all be better off and have more resources to actually spend on those social services. So that's the benefit of trying to bring into the formal sector. It's that domestic resource base too. Because I remember one of my African colleagues at the IMF one time saying in a board meeting, "We're tired of being treated like deadbeat countries. We're not. So stop it." And this was to everybody else sitting around the table. It's like, something, he's right. So we should be a little bit more careful. Because we're constantly talking about debt reduction, debt forgiveness. And it's like, wait a minute, no, we're more than that. And we want to develop our economies in a way that helps us help ourselves generate our own resources, be part of the system and benefit just like you have.
So we've got to wind up now, but it does actually, the question about informality sort of reminds me of something that I think runs through all of this, which is, and I'm constantly struck by it, the conversation we heard yesterday with the reference to the monkey houses and everything else. The challenge is, if you think about what economies need to do well in the next 20 or 30 years, the conversation you would have with what you might call an advanced economy and developing economy or emerging market economy is kind of much more the same now. I mean, the challenges they face are much more similar than they were 75 years ago. You talk about how do we bring, what is the negotiation between formal and informal? Well, the Uber workers facing the same issue. We're trying to work out where is the right place on the spectrum to have sort of flexible forms of working that can still be part of the system. So I'm constantly struck, no matter how obscure the place, like at Bishkek I was in a few months ago, they have some of the most basic subsistence agriculture still in Kyrgyzstan, but they're also facing a lot of these same issues around social media, or how do they raise productivity. The challenges are global, and I don't know, does that mean we're all in the monkey house now? I don't know, but it's certainly a very different kind of playing field. Thank you very much, Meg. And it is
Stephanie.
Honestly a good read. You don't have to just have it in your bathroom. I think you might even want to take it. You could take it on your flight home and enjoy it. Thank you.
Meg and Stephanie, thank you two so much. Thank you, ladies.